Welcome to ABA On Call. Join myself, Rick Kubina. Behavior analysis is a science of behavior. And Doug Kostewicz.
Focus on the individual, and you're going to see focus on behavior.
For thought-provoking conversation. Hey everybody, would you like to get a CEU for this episode? Listen closely for the announcement of 3 secret words delivered throughout the episode. Take note of those words and we will tell you where to go to get your CEU when the show is over. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of ABA On Call. Doug, I sound like a broken record when I always say, wow, we have another fabulous episode, but maybe I just need another line, but it's true. We have another fabulous episode coming at you, wherever it is. In your car, listening, watching us on YouTube, sharing it in a faculty meeting, wherever. We don't know, but it's going to be great. So, Doug, we have a guest today. Why don't you introduce our guest for us?
I guess I can. I've met her once or twice. So this is Dr. Olivia Enders, a recent graduate from the University of Pittsburgh Special Education Doctoral Program. Looks like she's in her brand new office. Is that the case?
Not quite. Brand new house.
Fabulous.
Yeah. I'm excited to be here with you all.
Well, we're excited to have you here. And Olivia here, and this is sort of our back to school special. And so we decided if we're going to do back to school, let's talk a little bit about some things that go in school. So Olivia is here and we're going to talk about the topic of behavior analysts, and special education, sort of the special education classrooms and public education. So go, Olivia. Tell us a little bit about this and what's in there.
Yeah, well, I have the unique experience of coming to ABA later on in my career. So I started my career as a learning support teacher. And of course, in my special education coursework to become a teacher, I heard ABA, I knew what the term was. I knew the basics, right? I was able to conduct an FBA. But it wasn't until I returned to my graduate studies at the doctorate level that I really started to make sense of a lot of what I experienced in the classroom through a behavior analytic lens. And so that being said, I've worked with behavior analysts in schools. I've done some of that consulting work. And so I'm really, really excited to share with you all a little bit about my experiences and how I think that together, working hand in hand, BCBAs working with special educators becoming BCBAs. This has such potential to benefit not only the schools broadly, but the students who we really want to serve. So I'm so excited to share with you about all of that.
Well, maybe we could start off by discussing what can behavior analysts do in schools? Like, how do you get a job and what do you do?
I think it really depends a little bit on your region, your location. When I, 10 years ago, being in schools and learning about being a special educator, we didn't really have, or at least BCBAs weren't often hired by school districts. That's changing, especially in the region that I'm in right now, which is down in South Carolina. Every school district actually hires a BCBA, and they are working to work with teachers, come into classrooms, be a part of that atmosphere. So BCBAs can actually be hired by school districts. I've also seen consultative models where a BCBA will work for an intermediate unit or another sort of governing agency where they'll go in on a sort of we need help basis and come in and work and give advice and work with teachers and run trainings. I've also seen BCBAs come in sort of like the advocacy space. So maybe a student is getting services at a clinic outside of the school, and the parents request that BCBA will come in and help support during the IEP meeting to make sure that the services that the student is receiving at the clinic are able to be brought into the school setting. So those are just a few of the ways that I've seen more recently BCBAs be involved in school settings. But I'm curious to see if you all have seen anything different.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable how much things have changed. When Doug and I met in the 90s, and when we were going through school at Ohio State, if you wanted to get a job as a behavior analyst in a school, I mean, I don't know about you, Doug, but I didn't even see that as a possibility. But then, we had insurance reform, and a big light was shined on ABA as being this very effective science of behavior change. And you fast forward to today, and as you said, I see jobs everywhere. Almost every state probably has a special role for a behavior analyst, and now what they do and how big their caseloads are, right. I think, as you said, is probably going to be dependent on the specific situation. But it's remarkable how many jobs are available now for behavior analysts in schools.
Well, what is interesting is to see 30 odd years ago, there really wasn't the title. You couldn't search kind of behavior analyst. Now, and then if you look at how, because when I was working for a while, you could go in as that consultant and work with a teacher or room, or usually that one child would be able to get you into a room that you were working with so you could help a teacher or some paraprofessionals. Now, like you said, the school districts are hiring behavior analysts at sort of that administrative level, which then their responsibilities. Well, actually, I would ask you, what are some of the responsibilities you've seen behavior? Because I've seen them expanding to teaching teachers in more groups, running professional, rather than that put a fire out, put a fire out, put a fire out. You see professional development. You see overall systems. So yes, it has grown and expanded because, as you said, Rick, the outcomes are there.
And I think another thing is that it has expanded quickly in a lot of cases. I know of a school district that hired a BCBA, and the BCBA told me about how they brought her in and they were like, now what do you do? So the buzz is there, right? And everybody knows it's effective, but I think some of that work actually ends up being on BCBAs to sort of craft how they can support a district to bring their vision, their understanding of behavior to school districts and sort of shape what they do in schools. So like you said, I've seen, it move away from being just putting out fires to more of that bigger picture things. Behavior analysts getting involved with school-wide positive behavior support systems in schools, working actually on really doing these trainings where we're working on increasing behavior-specific praise in the classroom. We are thinking about how we can sort of change common antecedents to make the space more accessible and better for all, to get the behaviors that we want students to do in the classroom. And so I think it's really exciting time. It can be really overwhelming because, again, a lot of that often falls on the behavior analyst to really take the charge and articulate their vision for how they see themselves transforming a space.
Yeah, I think, both of you hit on a really good area. Thinking about the transformation of behavior analysts in schools. When I was commenting earlier, you can't get those jobs where you have a caseload, you're in a class, you got to help people. But you both are talking about something that resonates with me. I have a colleague who is in Ohio. He works for the Dublin schools, and he's the leader and has a whole department of behavior analysts. And they go out and do all sorts of things. They support teachers. They consult with cases where and it's not just the behavior plans, but it's also learning. And that is, I find, wonderful that people are looking at behavior analysts as not just the, hey, we got this bad kid, change their behavior. Yeah. Actually, you're adding value in helping us solve problems.
And that instructional design piece is huge too, I think. I wanted to point out that too, because I think that so often BCBAs and schools can get pigeonholed on just the behavior end of things without thinking and always challenging ourselves that academics is behavior too, right? And we have a lot that we can say about instructional design and thinking about how we can write better goals for students and how can we measure those goals in a way that actually measures what we want to see progress and change. And so I think that's another key thing, Rick, that is really exciting about this moment in time right now.
Well, that brings us to our secret word for this segment, which is special education.
Okay, special education. One of the big things that come up and important, and not that everything is important, but one of the terms that we hear a lot is IEP. And behavior analysts are now being more involved with that. Olivia, can you briefly describe what an IEP is and tell us how a behavior analyst can be contributing to that when they're having different roles on that meeting? Because that's a very important process.
Yeah, absolutely. So IEP stands for Individualized Education Plan. Students who qualify under federal regulations for special education services all will have an IEP. The IEP tends to be done annually, but it can be revised, redone as needed as the student's sort of needs dictate. It's a really important document because it really outlines where the student is at, what are the student's strengths, what are their areas of need, how are the teachers going to support them, how are the teachers going to measure the goals that are set out for that individual student, and those goals are individualized, again, based on the student's specific needs. Typically at an IEP meeting, which the IEP meeting is when the team comes together to discuss what the plan is, what is this year going to bring for this student, what are we going to focus on, what do we need to change at that meeting. And I referenced the team. The team consists of general education teacher, a special education teacher, a representative from the school district or LEA, and the parents or caregivers. Now, like you said, BCBAs are becoming more and more involved in this process, and that's really exciting because they bring this unique knowledge of behavior, and they can really add a lot. I think one of the places I see BCBAs really being involved is in that FBA process. So they will conduct the FBA and come as a related service provider and talk through what changes need to be made to that student's environment in order to reduce challenging behavior or promote the positive behavior that we want to see. My biggest advice when I think about sort of the IEP process, this IEP meeting that happens, is that even though it happens once a year, BCBA should not only be involved in thinking about the IEP and discussing the IEP once a year. Prior to the IEP meeting, the BCBA really should be engaged in talking with the special educator, talking with the general educator, getting a sense of what accommodations are in place, getting a sense of what that student's day looks like, and helping throughout the process to write the IEP and craft it. I've sometimes seen folks come into an IEP meeting with an FBA, put it on the table and say, here it is, and it doesn't fit. And really, we want all of these pieces of the IEP to fit, to make sense together, to not be repetitive, to not contradict. And so I think it's so important, again, that BCBA is proactive, is reaching out. The first time that you read the IEP should not be at the meeting. You should know exactly what's in it and how all of the pieces fit together. And so, yeah, it's really exciting that BCBAs can bring this knowledge to this process. I will say, I think when I say that to people, hey, be involved, be proactive, sometimes there will be pushback and folks will say, well, there's not enough time in the day to collaborate. And that's where, again, I think harkening back to what we talked about earlier, you need to advocate. That's a huge collaboration, building those positive relationships with the team is a huge part of your role, and making sure that you're advocating for yourself, that you have time to do that, is just a critical component of making this really work.
Yeah. I mean, one of the underlying currents of what you're saying is this person is part of a transdisciplinary team. And you just gave some really good examples of how you can contribute. I think specifically from what I've seen, what are some of the big strengths of behavior analysts? And one of them is data collection. Like, I've been in some IEPs, I know you all have too, and probably our listeners who have been out there probably can recount their stories of just really poor measurement practices. I mean, you got a group of people, and if you have an occupational therapist in there, how much work did they get in their grad work learning? I mean, it's not, that's not a knock against them. It's just they don't study measurement like we do, and I think that's one area that can be contributed to this team.
I'm still shuddering thinking about the one IEP goal that I inherited in a student's IEP that was like, the student will have a positive disposition for 80% of the school day. And so, like, what is a positive disposition? If he smiles, am I counting that 80% of the school day? What does that mean? And so, yeah, I think that bringing this power of measurement is so valuable and can be so powerful, not only to the behavior goals, right? But thinking about how the analysts can work as a team to help improve across the academic goals, across everything, I think is a really great point, Rick.
Yeah.
So you mentioned also, because the BCBAs can be employees of the district that are in these meetings, but then also BCBAs can come as advocates for the parents, so they're not employed by the district. So have you seen some of these situations where a BCBA is coming in, not having the opportunity to work with things, and how that influences a meeting? What have you seen with that? Because they most definitely should be talking up, but you may get some pushback from a district.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that first, I want to say that IEP meetings tend to be very stressful for all involved. And I think the more you do, the more you do them, the easier they get, especially from, a special educator standpoint. But this is the parent's big, and the student, right? The student, as they, depending on what state you're in, will also be involved in this process. It's a big meeting. You're talking about strengths and weaknesses. And I know I'm friends with a parent who dreads her IEP meeting. And I think broadly we have to change that. But one of the things that parents will do then in order to get more support at those meetings is bring along somebody who they've trusted. And a lot of times that is, or maybe a BCBA that they have a really positive relationship with, who is working in their home or working with their student in a clinic. And so I would say in that case, just remember, tensions tend to be high. How can you condition yourself as a source of positive reinforcement for all there? And that doesn't mean don't advocate for that student. That doesn't mean don't challenge goals that are poorly written. But that means bringing that, and I joked about positive disposition goal, but here I am advocating it. Bring a positive disposition. See yourself as a collaborator, not as an antagonist. Also, be really sure as you're describing things to use translational skills in explaining what you want to see in the IEP. And what I mean by translational skills is, just as special education has tons of acronyms, tons of highly specialized language, BCBAs too, we have our own language at times. And I think sometimes making sure that you're realizing not everybody at that table even knows what FBA stands for. So how can we make sure that as we are talking through these things, we're putting them into terms that everyone can understand? And in that process also, finding things that the school may already be doing that we can build off of in a plan that may, not be written by a BCBA, it may not be written in the way that, we would write it, but it's very similar and it has some of those similar principles. So offering positive reinforcement for those, I think, again, really conditioning yourself as a source of positive reinforcement, looking there to support rather than to outwardly challenge.
Okay. So another term that we've heard, and our listeners may have heard different, it's a 504 plan. Can you briefly contrast the 504 plan and an IEP, which is an individualized education plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So an IEP is for students who are in need of specially designed instruction. So they have a demonstrated need academically, behaviorally, that they need this additional support. A 504 plan may be in place if the student does have a diagnosis or a medical condition. They need some accommodations, but they don't necessarily need that specially designed instruction. I've actually seen some schools will put a 504 in place first to see if accommodations will support, and then if the student continues to struggle, they'll move forward with the evaluation process to get the student an IEP. So I think behavior analysts can be really valuable also in 504 plans, because while there may not be a whole FBA attached, there may not be specific goals that are being measured, that's really an opportunity to look at accommodations. What things can we do? What we can bring our knowledge of the ABCs of behavior and think about, okay, accommodations, what on the front end, what antecedent are happening, and how can we, reduce stress for the students by changing the way that we're delivering instruction or changing the modality of how we're asking them to respond. And so I think while that role may look different, and while I have not seen BCBAs be as involved in that role, I think that's also a really other area for potential for BCBAs to support educators.
Well, fabulous answer. That brings us to our next secret word, which is IEP. This conversation makes me think, it's so on point and so on topic, and it brings us to our last segment, and that is, for all of us, and I'm sure if we had an hour we could spend on this segment, because as you were talking, immediately I was thinking forward to this segment, and that is, what are some do's and don'ts? And my mind immediately raced to the don't section, not just from what I've seen other people do, but some of the things that I've done in the past that I thought, boy, I really could have done those things better. But let me open that up to you. And give me something that you have seen that if you were giving advice to someone, something either to do or something they should definitely avoid.
So my second year in the classroom, again, I was serving in that special education role, had little to no knowledge of what ABA was. And I remember I was working with our autistic support classroom, and I was a learning support teacher, so I was in there helping out, doing some work with that teacher. And they were doing this program called verbal behavior, and I was like, what does that mean? And she was like, I don't know, they just have to point at things, and it's called attacked, and then they manned for stuff. And I was like, what language is she speaking? And I know I mentioned the language thing earlier, but I was so confused. And actually, when we really had this conversation about it, what I found out was that she also had no idea what these words meant. And she was running this program the best she could, but she only had, one block of consultation every quarter. And she sort of had to put the pieces together herself. And so all of that to say, when she said to me, I don't think we should be doing this program anymore, I don't get it. And I was like, yeah, I don't get it either. And looking back on that, I laughed, because now I see just the power that is, verbal behavior programming for students. And it makes me chuckle. But all of that to say is that I think we really need to teach, and to not just see our role as teaching the students that we serve, but we're teaching the professionals that we work with. We're not assuming that they are coming in with prior knowledge about this. Or if we are, we should actually come in with the assumption that they may have a lot of misconceptions. They may have read a lot of Alfie Kohn and have a totally different idea of what reinforcement means, or why it's bad for kids. And so I think seeing ourselves as educators of the folks that we're working with, and not in a condescending way, not in a, well, didn't you learn this kind of way, but rather in a way that says, this is why it's important. This is why TAKs are important. This is how MANs are going to open up this student's world and really reduce these challenging behaviors in the classroom, and bringing that passion for what you do into it, I think would go a long way, and probably would have changed that conversation that I had with that educator who was throwing her hands up at the air at this crazy program called verbal behavior. And so, yeah, I think that seeing ourselves not only as serving the students, but serving the teachers as well is just a huge do, I guess, so to speak.
My list, I mean, it's almost like we are thinking the same thing, and maybe that just happens because we live. There has been a debate in our field for a long time about, should we, on the one hand, keep our technical language pure and teach other people about what our technical language means? And I've asked this question when I've interviewed people and had just discussions with friends and colleagues. And all the time, the other side of this argument is from practitioners. Do you change and adapt so that people can understand and work with it? And I will say, 99% of, maybe 100% of all the practitioners, like I'm trying to think of someone who disagreed, everyone says if you can teach these concepts and translate them, that has a much higher success rate. So I think, at least from where I'm at, that's certainly the way to go. Like, I get the arguments about having this wonderful science, and if you shared, like, we all know there's a heck of a hard time learning the difference between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. People that's a real hard concept to get for people who aren't. So how do you do that? Do you say, you spend all this time trying to drill down on it, or do you do, as you said, translate it, which I think is the way to go?
And I think if you're in the classroom, you wouldn't teach, well, hopefully you wouldn't teach a student who is struggling 20 new vocabulary words and expect them to not only identify the definitions, but put them into practice. And so I think that's one of those things where I love the idea of keeping language precise. But I think we have to be practical. And how long do you have with this person? Are you consulting, or are you working with them year long? Across the whole school year? Can you slowly build up their knowledge, just like we would in the classroom? Teach one new word, reinforce its correct use, give examples and not examples slowly but surely. I think the don't, and I guess the big don't, would be to just introduce all of this language right at once, or introduce even all of these concepts at once, and then expect and walk away and expect the teacher to not be overwhelmed. Because a lot of times too, when I've seen BCBAs come in, the teacher may be overwhelmed. They may be struggling with certain behaviors in their classroom. And again, just like students when they're struggling, taking in new academic information is hard. If a teacher's struggling, it's just not going to be what they need. And so thinking about the needs of the teacher, yes, maybe slowly teaching new language, but thinking really carefully about how you can preserve the definitions of the words, how you can remain true to the concepts without necessarily having to get into the weeds of the language is so important.
This made me think that there's a different set of do's and don'ts if you're a consulting BCBA versus an all-the-time hired by the district BCBA. So you can set up a plan, as you mentioned, if you're at that district working with the same teachers, perhaps across multiple months and years, versus someone coming into the classroom to sell a intervention or implement some plan. I think the do's and don'ts slide a little bit. If I'm only with a teacher once or twice, I'm definitely leaning on what their knowledge is and how is this going to benefit them, because it's going to benefit the student, versus an attack that, listen to me, attack that a BCBA who's hired by the district can have an overarching plan of, we're going to slowly change just a common vocabulary so that we have something common to work from. And so that's my thing.
Yeah. Well, and Doug, as you were talking, I was really thinking too about another do, especially, depending on what the rules are. Again, always check sort of your agency, whoever you're working with, what are your rules for, interacting with students, who are you serving? But that being said, I think a huge do across all domains is to model. If a teacher sees that something works and they can see it work and you can model it for them, it's going to be that much more likely to actually get implemented. And the teacher, it's going to be concrete, as opposed to just sitting a teacher down and saying, I took this data, sort of away from the situation. I took this data. This is what you should do next time. And you'd be like, what does that look like? How would I even do that? So that modeling piece also, regardless of the role, I think, is such a huge component. Of course, if you can get some behavioral skills training in there, all the better. But that modeling is just so key for making the intervention or making the program come alive.
Yeah. I also thought, Doug, that was a really good point. I started thinking that you could have lists for almost each. Where are you contributing? Like, I would have a list of do's and don'ts for just the IEP process. There's a lot of things that you can do. One time I was in a meeting, and I was more of an observer than a participant. And the behavior analyst came in, did an FBA, and made all of these recommendations. And that BCBA was not at all transparent, ended up just doing an interview, and was speaking very authoritatively on, like, this is the plan and do this and that. I mean, I was kind of, when I found out that, oh, you're basing this off of just an interview, that needs to be shared, because there's a lot, it's much more probabilistic. Like, we know that interviews can give you some information, but boy, you really can't place a lot of stock in an interview.
Nope.
And that goes back to knowing, and really knowing, what do the procedures look like? What are the regular routines in the school? Because if you're suggesting something that is wildly different or just doesn't fit in what the school day looks like, I think that's only going to have you be seen sort of as that outlier, as that person who is, authoritative, maybe egotistical, coming in, telling them what to do without really knowing what your environment looks like. So yeah.
That brings us, believe it or not, to the third secret word, which is patience. Doug, Olivia, thank you so much for this conversation. I am sure our audience, for those who are in the field, maybe haven't even considered looking at special education as a possible role. I mean, we have many different places where folks in ABA can go, and I feel after this conversation that really was good, understanding what are some things you can do, what would be some things that could be contributed, and what are some things to avoid. So thank you for your time. And
Thank you,
I would like...
Thank you both for having me on.
It's our pleasure. Thank you all for joining us on ABA On Call.
Thanks for watching this episode of ABA On Call. To get your CEU, follow the link and instructions below the video. You can enjoy the program again there, or you can go straight to the attendance verification quiz. Just enter the secret words and pay the CEU fee to generate your certificate.